It's been over 30 years since I walked out of those woods for the last time, and I still can't shake the smell of pine and ozone, that metallic coldness that clung to everything in the high valleys. The truth I carry isn't about footprints or screams in the night. It's about discourse. It's about sitting across a fire, a tiny, terrified man teaching philosophy to something that should have been myth. How do you explain the concept of generational debt, of ecological suicide, to an ancient sentinel of the wild? I taught the Sasquatch the logic of 7 generations, and its resulting critique of human civilization was the single most brutal, devastating assessment I have ever received. It didn't just condemn us, it dismissed us. It showed me that the creature wasn't the monster in the woods, we were the disease on the landscape. If I told you the true nature of the conversation, you wouldn't believe me. No one ever has. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was Elias Vance. To the Forest Service, I was a high-altitude GIS specialist, a glorified map maker who understood hydrological flows and biomass depletion better than most biologists. But to myself, I was just a ghost haunting the Cascades, tethered to the high country by regret and the relentless, grinding hum of guilt. I had worked the deep valleys of Washington state since I was 22, initially running smoke-jumping crews, later transitioning to the solitude of monitoring stations and long-range seismic studies. I was built for isolation. My wife, bless her, finally saw that the mountains were my first love, my only enduring commitment. She left 10 years into our marriage, taking the dogs and leaving a note that simply read, "You love the silence more than my voice." She wasn't wrong. By the time the events began to unfold, I was 41 then, leathered by sun and perpetually smelling of stale coffee, bug spray, and the rich humus decay of the forest floor. I was living in a decommissioned fire lookout, Station 8A, about 60 miles north of any paved road. It was my sanctuary, a glass cage suspended over an empire of green. My days were monotonous, inputting telemetry data, adjusting satellite imagery for fire hazards, and mostly just watching the weather move in. The routine was a balm, a dull shield against the sharper edges of my internal life. But beneath the surface of the professional forester was an intellectual obsession. I wasn't satisfied just charting the trees. I wanted to understand the wisdom of the ecosystem. I had spent years immersing myself in ancient ecological philosophies, particularly the Haudenosaunee principle of Guyana-Shagoa, the great law of peace, and specifically, the decision-making metric of the 7 generations. The idea is simple, profound, and utterly absent from modern policy. Every decision we make today must be filtered through the lens of its potential impact on the 7th generation hence. It was my quiet rebellion against the short-sighted logging contracts and the quarterly reports that governed the Forest Service. I carried the weight of that philosophy like a religious text, often muttering the concepts aloud to the wind or the resident marmots. It was a comfort, a way to anchor myself against the tide of corporate destruction I saw creeping up the valley slopes. The true source of my isolation, the deep-seated tremor beneath the guilt of my failed marriage, was the death of old man Sterling. Sterling had been my mentor, a crusty, brilliant ethnobotanist who'd worked the region since the 1950s. He taught me how to read the forest not as a resource but as a library. Sterling didn't die of old age. He was found 2 years prior, crushed beneath a seemingly random pile of downed timber near the old Whispering Gap, a place notorious among locals for being perpetually foggy and unnervingly quiet. The official report called it a freak wind shear, but Sterling was too smart, too seasoned to be caught in a freak accident. The look on his face, frozen in rigor mortis, was not fear. It was sheer, unadulterated shock, mingled with a terrible, silent comprehension. I knew deep down he had seen something impossible before the end. His last words, scribbled on a damp journal page recovered miles away, were simply, tragically poetic. "They are watching the trees die." I had carried that cryptic sentence like a stone in my gut, letting it poison my sleep and cloud my judgment. Then came the disturbance. It wasn't a whisper or a distant cry. It was a wound in the earth so profound it screamed across my GIS screens before I saw it with my own eyes. It happened in the late autumn of '93. The air had that crisp, brittle quality, promising the first hard snow, and the low-slung clouds were pressing down, making the mountains feel close and judgmental. I was running a standard aerial infrared scan of the upper Skagit watershed, looking for latent hotspots from the previous summer's blazes. The satellite data, usually reliable down to a quarter acre, began to return impossibly fragmented results in a section known locally as the Devil's Kettle, a high, inaccessible bowl of ancient growth cedar and fir, officially designated as a protected, non-harvestable zone. The thermal imaging showed a perfect, unnatural void. A scar, roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, where the dense canopy should have been. No heat signature, no reflective surface, just a cold, absolute blank spot. I immediately assumed a sensor malfunction or a massive, unprecedented mudslide. I called it in, but my supervisor, a desk jockey named Harrison who cared more about budget than botany, dismissed it as cloud cover interference. I couldn't dismiss it. The integrity of that old growth stand was paramount, and the data was too precise for random error. The next morning, I secured the oldest, most reliable Huey available and flew out. As we crested the ridge, even the pilot, a laconic former Marine named Rico, who'd seen everything from forest fires to foreign wars, went silent. It wasn't a slide. It wasn't fire. It was the most perfect surgical clear-cut I had ever witnessed, but it was done with a terrifying absolute lack of machinery signature. The void in the forest was real, a pale, shocking expanse of broken earth visible even through the thinning fog. Rico put the Huey down on a high rock shelf overlooking the devastation, and the moment the rotors spun down, the silence hit us like a physical blow. It was a vacuum of sound. No wind rustling the remaining pines, no bird song, not even the drone of insects. Just the hollow echo of our own breathing. I walked the perimeter of the void for an hour, the damp earth cold under my boots. My knees were weakening with every step. My professional mind was cataloging the impossible. The sheer volume of timber removed was staggering, millions of board feet. But what disturbed me was the method. The trees weren't logged conventionally. They hadn't been cut at the base by a saw. They were snapped, broken off jaggedly about 10 to 15 feet up the trunk. But the break wasn't explosive like lightning or a directed blast. It was clean, torsional, as if some unimaginable force had simply gripped the trunks and twisted them until the fibers surrendered. Worse, the downed timber was stacked, not randomly tossed aside but arranged in monolithic piles along the southern edge of the clearing. The logs were interlocked with a structural integrity that defied simple physics. They formed colossal, crude barricades, defensive ramparts that looked like they had been built to keep something out, or perhaps to wall something in. The ground beneath these stacks was smoothed, almost polished, as if something heavy and soft had been dragged repeatedly across the earth. This wasn't an accident. This was labor. Organized, systematic, terrifying labor. As I moved deeper into the ruin, the sensory clues intensified. The air, already cold, seemed to press in, chilling me to the bone regardless of my heavy wool coat. Then came the smell. It wasn't the sweet musk I'd read about in the old journals, the typical Sasquatch scent, often compared to wet dog or rotten meat. This was different. This was ozone and metallic rot, yes, but mixed with something acutely sweet and fungal, like fermented wild berries buried deep underground. It smelled ancient, potent, and overwhelmingly organic. It smelled like the earth itself had festered. My breath caught in my throat. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up, not from a sudden sound, but from the profound, crushing weight of being watched. That old instinct honed by decades in the wilderness, the one that differentiates a bear stalking from a silent, patient predator, was screaming in my head. Run. I ignored it, driven by the professional duty to record and the personal horror of realizing that Sterling's death might have been tied to this impossibility. Then, I found the first piece of undeniable physical evidence, the first layer of the reveal that shattered my structured, scientific worldview. Near the base of one of the immense timber stacks, Where the broken trunks formed a perpendicular boundary were the footprints. They weren't muddy impressions. They were stamped deep into the rocky, compressed soil. Long, unbelievably broad, but unlike the flat, heavy tracks of a gorilla, these possessed a defined, almost elegant arch. They spoke of bipedal weight distribution perfected over millennia. They were huge, easily 17 inches heel to toe. But what truly horrified me was the stride. The distance between the impressions was over 8 feet, easily traversable by nothing short of a running horse, yet they were paced evenly, suggesting a casual, slow walk. I knelt down, tracing the outline of the impression with a gloved finger. It wasn't just size, it was intelligence. The print showed a clear, deliberate placement, navigating the rocky terrain without slipping. This was not a mindless brute stumbling through the forest. This was a creature in absolute control of its environment. But the final, terrifying piece of evidence that day wasn't the prints. It was what was placed next to them. Embedded in a small pile of freshly overturned dirt were 5 stones. Not random stones, but river-smoothed basalt, uniform in size, stacked in a precise, almost geometrical arrangement, 3 on the bottom, 2 on top. Next to the stone stack, neatly laid out on a bed of pulverized moss, were pieces of broken wood, meticulously arranged to form a series of parallel lines. It looked like a marker, a boundary sign, or perhaps a crude yet unmistakable pictogram. I realized, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rush in my ears, that this place wasn't just cleared. It was occupied, and whatever had done this was capable of symbolic communication. It was defining territory or perhaps issuing a challenge. I took the required photographic evidence, though I knew the pictures would never convey the suffocating terror of that place. I knew, with the cold certainty of a man facing the abyss, that the freak wind shear that killed Sterling was no accident. He had stumbled upon this architectural monstrosity, this silent, intelligent engineering project, and he had been silenced by the entities responsible. I flew back that evening in a haze of fear and professional disbelief. My official report was carefully sanitized. Evidence of highly unusual wind damage localized by geothermal activity requires further geological study. I didn't mention the tracks, the smell, or the symbolic stacking. I was not ready to be institutionalized, but I knew the official explanation, the localized storm, the freak bear, was a lie. That night, sitting alone in the fire tower, the radio static a useless shield against the absolute silence outside, I pulled out Sterling's journal. They are watching the trees die. No, they weren't just watching. They were rearranging the corpse, and they were warning the witnesses away with crude stone mathematics. I had to go back, not with a rifle, but with the only weapon I thought might work against an intelligence this ancient and possessive: philosophy. I decided then and there that I would teach whatever was out there, the logic of the 7 generations. I needed to know if they were destroyers or merely guardians reacting to our destruction. And that decision led me into a confrontation that changed everything I knew about humanity and myth. The year I turned 42, the Forest Service assigned me to Sector 9, right on the contested boundary of the Clearwater National Forest. This wasn't glamorous work. It was the quiet, brutal bureaucracy of the woods, marking demarcation lines, ensuring loggers didn't trespass into protected watersheds, and dealing with the perpetual slow-motion conflict between conservation and consumption. I thought I knew the forest. I thought its violence was predictable: fire, flood, the hunger of a desperate bear. I was wrong. The violence that found me that autumn wasn't physical. It was intellectual, an unsettling disruption that started in the very logic of the landscape itself. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. My daily life, before that line was crossed, was a comforting monotony of diesel fumes, damp canvas, and the crisp, clean scent of pine resin. I had my routines. Coffee brewed over a tiny portable stove before dawn, checking the perimeter markers by mid-morning, tracking deer populations and logging the subtle shifts in the seasonal migration patterns. It was the rhythm of a man who preferred silence to conversation, and predictability to surprise. But that predictability, that hard-won comfort, began to fray around the edges of Sector 9 in late September, right where the old growth met the recent clear-cut scar. The first sign wasn't visible, not in the daylight anyway. It was olfactory. I remember walking the boundary trail one afternoon, the air normally sharp and cool, carrying the familiar sense of decay and regrowth. But then came the intrusion. It was a heavy, musky odor, certainly animal, yet profoundly wrong. It was complex, not the rank decay of a dead elk or the sharp ammonia smell of a rutting deer. This smell was ancient, deep, and carried a subtle, almost sweet undertone, like spoiled honey mixed with ozone and the dampness of an unventilated cave. It hit the back of my throat, thick and paralyzing, forcing a biological pause in my stride, an instinctual recoil that my rational brain struggled to override. I had smelt bears, cougars, and every type of predator endemic to those ranges. But this was different. This spoke of immense size and a diet far more varied than simple scavenging, perhaps even hinting at cooked material or preserved flora. It implied sophisticated action. I tried to dismiss it as a localized fungal bloom or a particularly aggressive badger set, but the smell persisted for days, always strongest near the newly surveyed markers we had hammered into the ground, the very boundary defining human intention. It was as if the air itself was tainted by a constant presence, invisible but chemically undeniable. The sensory clues escalated into physical evidence. I was verifying the longitude and latitude of marker 44A, a large, yellow-banded cedar stump meant to signify the halt of the current logging operation. The stump was solid, the marker secure. But 20 feet further into the supposed protected zone, I found the first tangible sign of intent. It wasn't destruction. That would have been easy to categorize. It was rearrangement. A series of surveyor flags, the bright pink nylon strips meant to guide the loggers, had been pulled down. But they hadn't been torn or discarded. They had been carefully gathered, folded tightly, and placed like offerings at the base of 3 large granite boulders. These boulders formed a crude triangle, and atop the central one, an object had been placed, a large, smooth riverstone balanced precariously on its edge. It was an impossible act of equilibrium, defying the usual forces of gravity and weather. I knew with the cold certainty of a man who spends his life observing physics in the wild that this arrangement was recent, deliberate, and required tools or dexterity far beyond any known local fauna. I remember my knees weakening, my breath catching in my chest, not out of immediate fear, but out of disbelief at the sheer order of the chaos. This was not random vandalism. This was a statement, a correction, or perhaps a form of mapping that I didn't understand. I took photographs, close-ups of the stacked nylon, the impossibly balanced rock. I reported it as unauthorized tampering by unknown persons, sticking to the official narrative, though every instinct screamed that the perpetrator had no hands, no human tools, and certainly no union card. The sheer scale of the rearrangement suggested not just strength, but an aesthetic and architectural intelligence at play. Who or what would meticulously fold bright surveyor tape just to place it beneath a rock structure? It implied a critique of the object itself, a rejection of the markers of human ownership. The pattern continued over the next week. We moved the boundary markers further out, reinforcing them with heavier steel posts embedded in concrete. The disturbance responded instantly. This time, it was the brush clearance. A 10-foot swath had been cleared for the fire break, all debris stacked neatly on the logging side of the line. Overnight, every single log, every branch, every pile of deadfall was moved. Not scattered, but moved over the boundary line and reorganized into the protected watershed zone. And again, the rearrangement was systematic. The larger logs, those too heavy for a single man to move without heavy machinery, were laid out in a long, continuous barricade, completely sealing off the protected area. But within that barricade, the debris wasn't piled randomly. It was sorted. All the green, fresh limbs were placed at one end, the drier deadfall in the center, and the oldest, most rotted materials were placed at the far end, facing the direction of the stream. It was an organizational system that spoke of decay management, perhaps even fertilizer planning, an understanding of how biomass should be integrated back into the ecosystem, laid out in chronological order of decomposition. It was this sorting, this display of long-term planning that truly broke my composure. A bear breaks things, a person destroys things. But this entity ordered things, imposing a structural logic on our mess. It was as if the forest itself was demonstrating proper housekeeping, scolding us for our short-sighted, homogeneous piles of waste. I sat there, frozen near the barricade of massive logs, the morning dew heavy on the air, realizing that I was witnessing the physical manifestation of a critique. The creature wasn't just saying, "Stay out." It was saying, "If you must make waste, do it correctly, with respect for the cycles you interrupt." The sensory cues now intensified, moving into the behavioral layer of the mystery. The silence that had initially accompanied the smell now became absolute. A vacuum. When I was near the reorganized boundaries, the very air seemed to hold its breath. Birds ceased their chatter, the rustling of rodents vanished, even the omnipresent hum of mosquitoes disappeared. It was a suffocating quiet, a soundproofing effect that spoke less of a creature hiding and more of a creature commanding. One afternoon, conducting a solo perimeter check, I heard a sound that chilled me to the marrow, a sound that transcended mere animal vocalization. I had paused near the creek bed, examining a massive, impossibly deep track pressed into the mud, the print of a foot that dwarfed my own by threefold. As I knelt, sketching the dimensions in my journal, I heard it. A soft, deep sound, almost like a sigh, emanating from the dense spruce line about 40 yards uphill. I froze, pen suspended over the page. My heart began to drum a frantic, impossible rhythm against my ribs. Then came the sound again, clearer this time. It was a breath, but modulated. It didn't sound like a startled animal. It sounded like an imitation of my own breathing pattern. I had a slight irregularity, a shallow hitch in my inhalation left over from a nasty bout of pneumonia years earlier. I heard that hitch perfectly replicated, echoing down the slope. It wasn't an aggressive roar. It was stalking, but in an intellectual sense. It was observing me, analyzing my behavior, my weakness, my presence, and then using my own signature against me. It was learning me, becoming fluent in my biology. I didn't run. The terror was too complete for flight. I slowly stood up, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy frame of my field rifle, though I knew immediately that a firearm was useless against this kind of surveillance. I held my breath, stopping the pattern. The imitation stopped too. We stood in that profound silence, the Sasquatch and I, separated by 40 yards of spruce and a lifetime of human ignorance, engaged in a terrifying game of intellectual chicken. Finally, very deliberately, I pulled a small, worn canteen from my belt and took a long drink, forcing a loud, human swallow. From the trees, the response was immediate and devastating, a series of soft clicks followed by a resonant, hollow thump that shook the ground slightly beneath my boots. The click sounded like stone on stone, or perhaps large teeth rapidly tapping, and the thump was the sound of something immense but flat, impacting the earth. It felt like a deliberate communication, a refusal to engage in my trivial human pantomime, and a reassertion of its own presence and power. I retreated, professionally calm, physically shattered. I drove back to the station in a haze, the scent of musk and ozone clinging to my clothing like a shroud. The official explanation, which I dutifully typed out for the district manager, mentioned large mammal activity, likely aggressive bear behavior compounded by high winds causing debris rearrangement. It was a lie, and the manager, a man who had been counting down the days to his pension for 10 years, accepted it without question, filing it away as Sector 9 eccentricity. But I knew the truth was far more complex. The creature was teaching me. It was demonstrating the concept of consequence and order. The balanced stones spoke of precariousness. The sorted wood spoke of chronology. Every action was a lesson in time management beyond the scope of a single human lifespan. I began to spend all my time in Sector 9, drawn back by the chilling intellectual curiosity the creature had ignited. I stopped carrying my rifle openly, relying instead on my field binoculars and my journal. I had transitioned from being a steward of the forest to being a student of its most ancient inhabitant. I needed to understand the rules that governed the rearranged markers, the perfect silence, the calculated imitation of my own breath. I needed to grasp the depth of the planning I had witnessed, because if the creature was correcting the minor boundary disputes of a few loggers, what was its assessment of the larger, irreversible trespasses of humanity? The most compelling piece of physical evidence arrived 2 days later, near the site of the organized debris barricade. It wasn't large. In fact, it was unnervingly small and deeply personal. Nestled into the fork of a freshly snapped ponderosa pine branch, snapped at a height of nearly 10 feet, requiring immense upward force, was my old worn leather glove. I had lost it weeks earlier while fixing a flat on the truck further down the main logging road. I had searched for hours, resigning myself to its loss. Now, here it was, cleaned of all road grime, placed like a gift on a pedestal of fresh sapwood, and beneath it, pressed into the moist bark, was a symbol. It wasn't a familiar glyph or a simple scratch. It was a pattern of 7 deeply etched parallel lines, intersected by a single, perpendicular stroke, like a tally marking the completion of 7 cycles. It was the first time I saw the mathematical logic manifested clearly. 7 markers, 7 generations. The foundation of the teaching had been laid, meticulously and relentlessly, using my tools, my boundaries, and my lost objects, all leading to this moment of silent, ancient geometry. I picked up the glove. It was still damp, smelling faintly of that familiar, musky ozone. Holding it, I understood. I hadn't lost it weeks ago. It had been recovered, held, cleaned, and returned. It was a gesture of profound intelligence, protection, and ownership. The creature had protected my property and, by doing so, asserted its knowledge of my movements and its ability to influence my life utterly. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, not the power to destroy, but the power to save, to restore, and to communicate a long-view philosophy that we humans had utterly abandoned. I was being watched, analyzed, and prepared for a lesson in ancestral ethics, a lesson I realized I desperately needed, regardless of the terror it instilled. The full confrontation I knew was imminent. I had passed the test of observation. Now the direct instruction would begin. It had been a mistake to assume instinct. That was the primary failure of my whole career, perhaps the central failure of my life. Mistaking deep, ancient intelligence for mere animal instinct. The air in that valley was colder than it had any right to be. Not just the temperature, but the spiritual cold of realizing your entire species is running the wrong calculation. I returned to that spot repeatedly. I couldn't help myself. My official patrols became elaborate, meticulously planned diversions. I would file routes leading miles away, only to park the truck deep in a hidden logging spur, strap on snowshoes, even when the snow was marginal, and hike back toward the convergence of the 3 creeks, the place where the silence always seemed to swallow sound. The communication, when it started, wasn't voice. It was geometry and pattern. The creature, I still couldn't call it a name, it felt too intimate, too much like admitting kinship, used the earth as its slate. It utilized stones not stacked randomly, but placed with such precision that they formed astronomical models, alignments that suggested cycles far longer than the human concept of a century. It manipulated deadfall, snapping thick trunks not just for speed or strength, but to create specific angles, triangles that pointed toward the rising points of certain constellations I recognized from my old navigation courses. It was teaching me a language built on time, weight, and consequence. The first concept I grasped, or rather the first concept it forced me to confront, was the nature of the immediate. The creature would bring me things, a handful of plastic wrappers I had carelessly discarded weeks earlier, now clean but still recognizable. A freshly snapped pine bough, a small, perfect mushroom that would rot completely within 3 days. It would arrange these items in a line, then gesture with heavy, deliberate movements toward the fast-moving current of the creek. Immediate. Gone. Consequences felt instantly, or too late. Then, its teaching method changed. One freezing afternoon, after I had spent hours clearing brush in a small meadow to signify my own understanding of tending and order, I found a new arrangement. This time, it wasn't plastic or ephemeral life. It was heavy, enduring, and heartbreakingly simple. 3 massive granite stones, each weighing perhaps 50 pounds, were positioned to represent the past, the present, and the future. Next to them, resting in a depression it had clearly carved with its enormous prehensile fingers, were 7 perfectly symmetrical river stones, polished smooth by millennia of running water. I stood there breathing shallowly, the vapor condensing instantly in the -15 air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, frantic drummer demanding attention. I knew what the granite meant: weight, permanence. The creature emerged then, not suddenly, but flowing out of the dense shadow beneath a 100-foot spruce. It didn't make a sound, it simply became visible. The sheer scale of it always stopped my breath. The shoulders like massive boulders, the fur a color somewhere between obsidian and wet earth. But it was the eyes, the color of old, dark amber, intelligent and infinitely sad, that held the entire lesson. It did not approach me. It simply looked at the 7 small stones, then to the vast expanse of the ancient forest rising up the slope, and then back to me. It made a low humming sound, more vibration than noise, the resonance of deep earth. That was the lesson. The 7 generations. It wasn't a complex philosophical treatise delivered in human words, but a single undeniable law of physics, biology, and time. Every action taken in the present, the snap of that pine bough, the placement of the plastic wrapper, the decision to cut a specific tree, had to be measured not against my lifespan or the lifespan of my children, but against the survival criteria of the 7th generation yet to come. I was professionally a conservationist. I had spent my life thinking about 5-year timber rotation plans, 20-year reseeding cycles, and the immediate impact on local flora and fauna. But the Sasquatch's logic rendered those concepts childish, short-sighted, and ultimately self-destructive games played within a crumbling sandbox. We were calculating interest rates while ignoring the fundamental depletion of capital. The subsequent critiques were delivered with a chilling objectivity that transcended mere anger. The creature guided me, always silently, always watching, to observation points. We weren't looking at local ecological issues. We were looking at the human footprint from a truly ancient perspective. One day, we climbed high above the valley floor, far higher than any casual hiker would ever venture. From that granite ledge, the view was panoramic, sweeping over perhaps 50 square miles of managed forest, stretching all the way to the distant haze of the nearest large city, 30 miles away. The creature paused, its bulk a stark silhouette against the pale winter sun. It pointed, first with its head, then with a thick, powerful arm, toward 3 distinct phenomena. First, the logging activity miles away. The clear cuts looked like terrible infected wounds on the green skin of the mountain. I had always rationalized that. Sustainable harvest, selective thinning. The creature showed me the sheer, unrelenting speed of the deforestation. It didn't see economic necessity. It saw accelerated erosion, the immediate shift in water flow, and the disruption of the migratory patterns of creatures whose lineages predated recorded human history. It saw a future forest that would be perpetually younger, perpetually weaker, perpetually less diverse. You eat your seed corn, the gesture implied, and you call it abundance. Second, it directed my attention to the city haze. That smog, usually just an inconvenience, suddenly became a palpable symbol of our relentless internal combustion addiction. It made a deep, rattling noise, not a threat, but a sound of profound distress or perhaps disgust, and gestured toward its own massive chest. Then up at the clear sky directly above us, it was asking, "Why do you purposefully foul the air you must breathe?" The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. We are the only species that knowingly poisons its own wellspring, while simultaneously celebrating the poison as progress. The most damning critique, however, involved memory and waste. The creature led me to the edge of an old, unofficial dump site, hidden deep in a fold of the hills, one that the Forest Service had been promising to clean up for years. We stood there looking down at generations of compressed garbage, rust, plastic, tires, and old mattresses. The Sasquatch reached down and picked up a broken piece of a plastic child's toy, a vibrant, molded piece of fleeting joy that had been discarded 20 years ago. It held the plastic in its hand, turning it slowly. Then, it looked at the surrounding soil, the decomposition happening at the microscopic level, the slow, organic return to the earth. Its eyes, when they met mine, were heavy with pity. The creature conveyed the concept of forever. This bright, synthetic shard, created in a moment of human distraction, would outlive the next 10,000 generations of squirrels, birds, and insects. It would remain an indelible, indigestible mark on the earth long after the humans who made it were dust. You create things that your world cannot digest, the gaze commanded. You leave permanent wounds and fleeting moments of greed. This is not intelligence. This is fever. I felt physically ill. My carefully constructed identity as a protector of the wilderness began to corrode, dissolving under the weight of this ancient non-human wisdom. I was not a protector. I was a janitor trying to manage the symptoms of a terminal, societal disease. The guilt was overwhelming. All those years I thought I was doing good. All the awards and commendations suddenly felt like prizes for being the most diligent slave to a suicidal system. I started sleeping less, haunted by the images of the 7 small river stones lying next to the massive, unmoving granite blocks. I saw the eyes of the 7th generation looking back at me, accusing me of knowing the truth and still participating in the destruction. My own communication attempts were clumsy, pathetic. I tried to show it complexity. I drew diagrams of our civilization, the feedback loops of economy, education, infrastructure. I used chalk and charcoal, trying to explain the necessity of growth, the inevitability of production. The creature would watch me patiently, sometimes for hours, without moving, allowing me to exhaust myself in my defense of human folly. And then, it would simply wipe away my intricate flowcharts with one swipe of its hand, erasing the lines of human reasoning, and replacing them with a single deeply scored symbol in the mud, a circle with a break in the top. Broken cycle. Unsustainable. I remember one specific evening, the fog rolling in thick and silent, muffling the world. I was freezing, shivering not from the cold but from the psychological exposure. I sat hunched over trying to light a small, contained fire, a meager symbol of human comfort and control. The creature was watching from the periphery. I felt its presence, heavy and judgmental, but not malicious. I looked up at it, my voice raspy from disuse, and asked the only question that mattered, the one I knew it wouldn't answer in English, but only through deeper symbolic teaching. Why? Why do you care about the 7th generation of our people? It tilted its massive head, and the movement was slow, deliberate, almost geological. It lifted its arm and slowly pointed, not at me, nor at the forest, nor at the distant city. It pointed straight down at the earth we were standing on. The meaning was clear, instantaneously transmitted, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. There is no your people or my people on this world. There is only the soil, the water, and the air. We are all passengers on the same small stone, and if your fever consumes your compartment, it will eventually poison the whole vessel. It wasn't protecting humanity out of altruism. It was protecting the ecosystem of which it was an integral ancient steward. Our destruction was a geological threat, and the creature, acting as a sentient anchor of the natural world, was simply trying to stabilize the ship before we sank it entirely. That night, for the first time in my life, I understood true, non-negotiable fear. It wasn't the fear of being eaten or attacked. It was the terrifying fear of being judged by an entity vastly superior in temporal understanding, found irrevocably guilty, and understanding that the jury of the natural world had already delivered its verdict against us. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the trees, swallowing the sounds. swallowing even the light of my small, pathetic fire. The Sasquatch began to move away, back into the impenetrable darkness, leaving me alone with the weight of that 7-generation burden. A concept so immense it felt like a physical object pressing down on my chest, slowly collapsing my lungs. I knew then that my life as a ranger, as a man who believed in the official rules and boundaries, was over. I had received forbidden knowledge, a terrifying, brutal critique delivered not by a moral philosopher, but by the living embodiment of the planet's oldest memories. And I knew I had to go back again, not just to learn, but to confess. The next stage of the confrontation, the true immersion, was about to begin. It would involve sacrifices I wasn't yet ready to face, and the final breaking of the man I used to be. The forest was no longer a place of work. It was a cathedral of crushing truth, and I was merely a student, kneeling at the feet of an impossibly large, ancient teacher. I wrapped myself in my thermal blanket, pulling the coarse wool tight, but I couldn't escape the cold, crystalline clarity of the creature's logic. We were a species running toward a cliff, celebrating the speed, and calling the inevitable fall progress. And the ancient ones were watching, shaking their massive, sorrowful heads. The logic of the 7 generations was not something I could simply hand him, wrapped up neatly like a textbook lesson. It had to be absorbed, assimilated into a consciousness that already operated on timescales far exceeding mine. For us, a few decades is a long life. For him, the concept of 200 years forward, of measuring the health of the earth not by the next harvest but by the consequences landing on the great-great-great-great-grandchildren, was less a radical idea and more a terrifying assessment of our sudden, violent discontinuity. He didn't speak the way we do, of course. His communication was weighted in telepathy, thick with implication, a silent pressure in the air that forced the images into my mind. I had to articulate the human system first, to provide the basis for his eventual chilling analysis. I spent weeks translating concepts that should never have existed: planned obsolescence, quarterly growth, externalized costs. I drew diagrams in the dirt with sticks, diagrams that looked like the etchings of a madman, trying to explain why we build objects designed to fail, why we actively court decay simply to keep the engine of acquisition turning. The air around him always felt heavier during these sessions. It wasn't anger. It was an immensity of confusion, a deep, resonant bewilderment. When I finally explained the core of the 7 generations, that every decision made today must be filtered through the potential suffering or prosperity of the 7th generation yet unborn, his stillness was absolute. His eyes, dark pools reflecting the faint light filtering through the canopy, didn't blink. He wasn't evaluating the morality. He was evaluating the fundamental sanity of a species that would deliberately choose to sever that essential link. "You bury the future," he transmitted, the thought hitting me with the force of a low-frequency hum. Not a question, but a cold, final statement. I tried to defend it, stammering about economic pressures, about the complexity of modern life, the necessity of competition, pathetic excuses even to my own ears. I was standing there, a spokesperson for the global mechanism, apologizing for the inevitable wreckage we were scheduling. "You claim the ability to see far," the thought pressed, deep and unwavering. "Your calculations are intricate. You can predict the path of the star, the movement of the tide. Yet you cannot see the obvious ruin beneath your own footstep." His critique began not with grand philosophical statements, but with observation of the immediate. He asked relentlessly about waste. I'd brought basic supplies into the woods: canned food, plastic sheeting, a small amount of engine oil for the generator I had hidden miles back. Every item became evidence against us. He fixated on a crushed aluminum can, discarded near my fire pit, though I had planned to pack it out. I explained how it was recyclable, how the material could be melted down and used again. "It costs more energy to move the failed object than the object provided originally," he stated. "You introduce instability into the soil, confusion into the animals, simply to save a few moments of effort in the moment of consumption. The saving you describe is imaginary. The debt is real, and it is paid by the ground itself." I remember the profound shame washing over me. Here was a being who lived in equilibrium, whose footprint dissolved within a season, who saw the forest floor as a seamless continuity of life and death. And I was explaining how my species had engineered perpetual chemical immortality for the remnants of our snacks. The concept of speed was another source of profound judgment. I had a truck. I had explained how we travel vast distances in hours. I showed him maps trying to convey the scale of our highways, the webbing of concrete across the continent. He focused on the noise, the constant, intrusive noise of our machines. The air sings, he communicated, referencing the natural sounds of the valley, the wind through the pines, the rush of the river, the calls of the owls. Your movement silences the song. It is a shout, constant, everywhere, even when you are not present. You build roads that are veins of fever, transferring your haste into the body of the earth. When you move that fast, you cannot possibly notice the life you crush, the roots you sever, the warnings you ignore. The generations yet to come will inherit the silence you create, not the speed you boast. It was a chilling indictment of our focus on efficiency over presence. He lived his life rooted, observing every shift of the light, every scent of rain. We live our lives rushing past everything, convinced that the destination justifies the massacre of the journey. He then moved to the most difficult subject, surplus and possession. In the deep wilderness, the concept of taking more than you need, especially when others require it, is nonsensical and self-destructive. If one member of the pack hoards the resources, the pack weakens. It is an evolutionary dead end. I had tried to explain the stock market, the accumulation of intangible wealth. I told him about the vast silos of grain, the mountains of discarded clothing in landfills, all while people starved or froze in the cities I had left behind. His reaction was not contempt, it was intellectual horror. If the future depends on the health of the community, he reasoned, the thoughts forming sharp edges in my mind, and the community suffers from lack while others hold endless plenty, then the system is not merely flawed, it is malignant. It is designed to starve itself. You do not store for the lean season. You simply hold control over the flow of life, demanding tribute for survival. He paused, a deliberate, suffocating pause that stretched the fabric of the reality around us. I could hear my own shallow breathing echoing in the stillness. If your great-great-grandchildren are hungry, and you knew today that the means to prevent their hunger was locked away by those who already had too much, what word describes your society? I couldn't answer. Treachery? Madness? He supplied the answer, without sound, yet it deafened me. Terminal. His application of the 7 generations logic was mercilessly practical. It wasn't about feeling bad, it was about tracing the inevitable causal chains. He saw our present actions as literal bombs set to detonate 200 years hence. Every toxic spill, every clear-cut hillside, every ton of plastic churned out was an act of intergenerational violence. And we documented it, cataloged it, and marketed it as progress. I started spending my nights trying to find counter-arguments, scouring the few books I had brought, works on conservation, on indigenous philosophy, on desperate attempts at sustainability. But the truth was, everything I found was compromised. Even the most well-meaning effort usually involved massive infrastructure, externalized costs, and complex dependencies that, when viewed through Cale's deep temporal lens, looked flimsy and unsustainable. He saw time differently. For him, the past wasn't history. It was the foundation he stood upon, the wisdom of the elders who died hundreds of years ago informing his every move. The future wasn't abstract. It was the sacred ground being prepared for those who had yet to emerge from the darkness. We, the human race, saw time as a commodity, to be spent, wasted, or raced against. The teaching sessions became less about my lecturing and more about my agonizing defense of our civilization. I found myself revealing the deepest hypocrisies of modern life, the reliance on fossil fuels that heat the atmosphere, the mining practices that poison the rivers, the endless warfare conducted over resources that should be shared. I remember the day I tried to explain the concept of debt. Financial debt. How generations are born owing abstract currency to institutions that exist only on paper. Kyle stood up slowly, stretching his immense, powerful frame to its full height, dwarfing the pine trees around him. It was the only time I felt true, primal fear during a teaching session. Not because he was angry, but because I knew I had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the universe. "You enslave the ghosts," he transmitted, his presence overwhelming the small clearing. "You bind the unborn. They are born into a contract they did not sign, to fulfill obligations that benefited only the long dead. This is not governance. It is profound spiritual cruelty." He walked away then, melting into the dense brush without a sound, leaving me alone with the weight of that statement. "You enslave the ghosts." I sat there for hours, the fire dying down to embers, the cold soaking into my bones. The Sasquatch, the ancient being of the forest, the creature we categorize as a myth or a primitive animal, had just articulated the moral catastrophe of modern global economics more clearly and brutally than any human economist. The guilt I carried was no longer personal. My failed marriage, my lost career, the friend I couldn't save. Now the guilt was collective. I was tainted by the systemic failure of my species, judged by the silent, judging eyes of a creature who lived by the ancient, unbroken contract with the earth. I realized that by teaching him the 7 generations logic, I hadn't enlightened him. I had merely given him the perfect lens through which to calculate the exact timing and methods of our self-destruction. And he saw nothing in our current trajectory that indicated a capacity for change. The brutal part of the critique wasn't the assessment of the damage, but the cold, analytical certainty that we were structurally incapable of repentance. The only way the 7th generation could be safe, I understood then, was if the 5th and 6th generations, my generation and the one immediately following, were somehow stopped from propagating the terminal infection. That meant that we, the architects of the unsustainable, were the greatest threat to the future he was sworn to protect. And I, the desperate old man, had handed him the blueprint for our own systemic failure. It was a truth too immense, too corrosive to ever confess to the world outside this remote valley. I was the traitor who provided the data. I was the unwitting witness to the verdict. The forest held its breath, waiting for the execution. Some truths are heavier than mountains, and they press down on the soul until there is nothing left but dust and regret. I should have kept the knowledge locked away, safe in my own ignorance. But I shared it, and now, the reckoning had begun. He was no longer just observing. He was preparing to act based on the deep, horrifying knowledge I had imparted. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. It's been 40 years, and the shadow of that conversation still sits right behind my eyes. I can feel the weight of it in the marrow of my bones, a coldness that no summer sun can ever truly burn away. I thought I was giving him a gift, a language structure that transcended his silent, instinctual wisdom. I gave him the tool he needed to dissect us, to look into the core of humanity, and deliver a verdict that felt ancient and utterly final. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. That morning, the air was sharp, smelling of pine needles and impending snow, even though the calendar still claimed it was early autumn. We were high up, near the abandoned copper mine where the air thinned and the silence was so profound, it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. I had spent days trying to articulate the concept of 7 generations planning. It wasn't just a formula, it was a deep, spiritual commitment to the unborn. I used metaphors of rivers and forests, of salmon runs and cedar bark, trying to translate something sacred into the crude English I knew he was assimilating through shared thought and careful observation. He listened, or rather, processed. There was never any impatience in him, only an almost frightening capacity for deep, unbiased intake. I remember the tilt of his enormous head, the way his dark, wet eyes that held the depth of ancient volcanic pools, focused not on me but seemingly through me, toward some distant horizon where the generations stretched out like fading smoke. Then, the shift happened, the trigger event. It wasn't a growl or a stomp. It was the cessation of all external noise. He had been emitting a low, resonant hum, a sound more felt than heard, that I had come to associate with his focus. When that hum stopped, the silence that replaced it was heavy, judging. He had mastered the logic. He understood the sanctity of the seventh generation. And then, he turned the mirror back onto us. The realization came in layers, a brutal series of psychic images and compressed thoughts that slammed into my consciousness with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't a human voice speaking. It was a pure, unfettered intelligence articulating absolute truth, devoid of the emotional padding and self-deception that make human reality tolerable. The first layer was simple observation. Your planning horizon is shorter than the life cycle of the insects you fear. He showed me the short-termism. He didn't use words like economy or politics, but he showed me the quickness, the ceaseless churn. He showed me the fleeting excitement over objects that would become debris within a year. He showed me the frantic scramble for momentary advantage, the quarterly reports, the electoral cycles, the obsession with the present moment as if the past had been deleted and the future didn't exist beyond the immediate needs of the living. In his mind, applying the 7 generations principle, a civilization must act as custodians, never owners. We, however, acted as frantic heirs emptying the estate before the will was even read. He saw our addiction to speed and extraction as a pathological fever. He showed me, through the resonant clarity of his thought, the pipelines cutting through the ancestral lands, not just of his kind, but of the land itself. He showed me the clear cuts, those gaping wounds on the hillside, and the calculation wasn't about the next 100 years of growth, but the next few months of profit. The sensory clarity of his critique was overwhelming. I smelled the acrid scent of plastic burning, the sickening sweet smell of waste decomposing in vast uncovered pits. I saw the rivers choked with the sludge of industry, and the image was accompanied by his profound telepathic question. If the water is broken for the 7th generation, what defense is left? The official versions of our actions, the permits, the environmental impact reports, the governmental explanations, were mere whispers against the roaring evidence of our collective destruction that he perceived. He didn't care about our justifications. He only saw the outcome, a continuous, systematic looting of the future. The sheer volume of material we discarded, the monuments of trash we built, baffled him. He understood survival, the necessity of taking what one needed. He did not understand the need for more, the constant thirst for surplus that served no purpose but momentary satisfaction, creating only burden for those to follow. The confrontation deepened, settling into a cold, hard despair. We were sitting beneath a massive old-growth Douglas fir, its trunk wider than my truck. Its silence and stability were the perfect backdrop for his judgment. The focus shifted from material consumption to spiritual poverty. He looked at the structures of our society, the dense, towering cities, and saw not innovation but isolation. You build walls to keep out the forest, and then you build smaller walls to keep out each other. He critiqued our relationships. He saw the way families fractured, the way communities dissolved into individualized bubbles focused on screens and manufactured noise. In his world, the clan, the lineage, the collective memory, that was the central pillar, spanning millennia. In ours, the generational bonds seemed fragile, easily snapped. Children were separated from the wisdom of their elders. The wisdom itself was often discarded as irrelevant data. He used the term, the Great Forgetting. It resonated in my mind, a chilling term for our historical amnesia. We forget the famines, the plagues, the consequences of past mistakes, believing the technology of the present exempts us from the cyclical laws of nature. Because we forget the price paid by the ancestors, we feel no responsibility toward the descendants. The critique was brutal because it was internally consistent. He had absorbed the principle of foresight and found us utterly lacking in even basic hindsight. He looked at war, not as a political conflict, but as a catastrophic failure of generational stewardship. We kill the young, the very resource needed for the seventh generation, and poison the land they would inherit. He showed me the flash of explosives, the burnt earth, and the lingering residue of toxins. You consume your own seed, he communicated, the thought laced with an ancient pity that was somehow worse than contempt. I tried to defend us. I mumbled something about progress, about medicine, about the fleeting comforts that human ingenuity had produced. His response was immediate and devastating. He showed me the difference between healing and sustaining. Yes, we could temporarily fix the physical body, but the underlying illness, the illness of unsustainable desire, we not only ignored but celebrated. He showed me the hospitals overflowing with ailments born of pollution and stress. He showed me the pharmaceuticals designed not to cure the root cause, but to manage the symptoms of a broken relationship with the earth. Your greatest skill, his thought pulsed, is convincing yourselves that the sickness is merely temporary discomfort. The climax of his revelation centered on the fatal flaw he identified, our inability to accept true scarcity and mortality. Because we believed we could always invent our way out of any hole, or simply move to a new, pristine place, a belief rooted in the fantasy of infinite resources, we never truly valued what we had. He showed me the deep, inherent patience of the forest, the slow, geological timescale upon which true life operated. Then he contrasted it with the frantic 7-decade blur of a modern human lifespan, spent primarily in the pursuit of things that would be meaningless within 2 decades. He said nothing about gods or spirituality in the human sense, but he articulated a responsibility so profound that it constituted a fundamental moral law. You are the memory of the past and the seed of the future. By destroying the memory and consuming the seed, you negate the definition of life itself. His critique wasn't just intellectual, it was biological. He found our society biologically unsound because it prioritized the individual instant over the collective duration. He found us self-terminating, a short-lived anomaly in the long, slow, purposeful march of evolutionary time. I remember clutching my head, the cold of the morning seeping into my bones, suddenly feeling small and utterly exposed. I had gone into the woods seeking connection, seeking the truth of the wild, and I had received the truth of my own species' demise, delivered by a creature we considered a myth. He stood up then, his immense shadow falling over me. The scale of him was always shocking, but now the intellectual scale was paralyzing. He wasn't judging me personally, but the societal structure that had created me, that had made me blind until he gave me the clarity to see the rot. The guilt that followed that moment was absolute. I, a simple forest ranger, had handed this ancient intelligence the exact framework needed to conclude that humanity, in its current form, was a dangerous, terminal disease to the planet. My simple act of teaching became, in my mind, the ultimate betrayal of my own kind. After that encounter, I was poisoned. I saw the 7 generations concept applied everywhere. Every plastic cup, every high-speed delivery truck, every poorly insulated McMansion built on fragile wetlands. It was all evidence proving his devastating point. The world that had once seemed normal became a frantic, wasteful, suicidal machine, spinning ever faster toward collapse, justified by complex explanations that amounted to nothing more than sophisticated denial. I quit the ranger service 3 months later. I couldn't look at a logging permit or a new campsite application without seeing the ghost of the 7th generation screaming its silent protests. The sheriff closed my case as stress leave. The government never came, but the nightmares continued. I couldn't isolate myself enough. The truth he showed me was carried in the wind, in the taste of the river water, in the anxious, distracted eyes of every person I met. Decades have passed. My voice trembles now, not just with age, but with the chilling knowledge that the prognosis he gave us was likely final. We did not heed the warning inherent in his critique. We accelerated. We doubled down on the quick fix and the short horizon. I often wonder if he is still watching, still applying that devastating 7-generation logic to the spiraling chaos we call civilization. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but the truth they carry is still out there, waiting for us to finally stop running. The question is no longer if he was right, but only how quickly his brutal critique will be validated by total silence. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. The silence after his words. That was the sound of absolute echoing judgment. I tried to teach him wisdom, the long view of time, the sacred responsibility we inherited from the Iroquois elders, the logic of the 7 generations. But what he taught me in return in that final clearing was the brutal arithmetic of our own failure. We are the 7th generation, but we only ever planned for the 1st. I carry that scar deep inside, the weight of his ancient eyes, the unbearable shame of what he concluded about us. If you knew the truth of what that creature understood, you'd never sleep soundly again. You would only hear the rustle of leaves, knowing that something out there has already cataloged your sins and found your civilization wanting. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was 38 then, a man defined by the utility of his hands and the practicality of his boots. I was not a philosopher, merely a forest manager, trying to protect trees from fire and politicians from themselves. My backstory is irrelevant now, except to establish the arrogance I carried, the belief that I, the educated man, had something essential to teach the ancient world. I had lost my wife years prior, not to divorce, but to the slow, steady erosion of neglect. My time always given to the forest, never to her. That guilt, the guilt of the short-sighted, was already baked into my soul, a foundation for the larger universal guilt that Kasha would later impose upon me. I was a man who understood cycles, the water cycle, the growth cycle, the fire cycle, but I had failed utterly to grasp the moral cycle of stewardship. The final meeting wasn't triggered by a sudden sound or a missing hiker. It was triggered by an internal collapse. I had been feeding him the principles for months, bringing him scrolls and drawings detailing the necessity of assessing every decision, every harvest, every construction, every piece of waste, through the lens of those who would inherit the earth 7 generations hence. I left the final notes by the ancient stone altar we shared, a summation of the core values: sustainability, restraint, reverence for the soil. I waited for days, feeling the cold rain soak through my canvas tarp, waiting for the intellectual conversation to resume. But Kasha did not appear to talk. He appeared to render a verdict. I found the clearing one last time. It was a space so unnaturally silent, so devoid of the normal buzzing cacophony of the woods, that the air itself felt heavy, pressurized by expectation. It wasn't the scent of musk or the sight of shattered branches that announced his presence. It was the sheer, agonizing rightness of the silence. My knees weakened, not from fear, but from the spiritual gravity of the moment. He was standing maybe 20 feet away, partially obscured by the mist clinging to the fallen timber. He was vast, of course, a moving shadow sculpted from obsidian and wet ironwood, but it was his posture that struck me. He wasn't wary or aggressive. He was weary, infinitely, painfully weary. I tried to whisper his name, the clicking, throat-clearing sound he had tolerated, but the sound died in my throat. He hadn't been stalking me in the physical sense for weeks. He had been stalking the idea I had given him. He had been running the numbers, checking the ledger of human action against the sacred promise of the 7th generation. The sensory clues were now entirely emotional, a crushing atmosphere of disappointment that seeped into the very moss beneath my feet. I remember thinking, the official explanation for all the localized environmental decay, the sudden toxic algae blooms, the unexplained soil sterilization in the valley, the quick decline of the migratory bird routes, was always framed in terms of unforeseen industrial runoff or natural climate shifts. The local sheriff, a decent man, stuck to the bare hypothesis regarding any structural damage. Even the Forest Service, after the initial alarm, settled on the convenient lie: hallucinations due to isolation. But I knew those things, the poisoned river, the dead soil, were not random variables. They were the very examples Kasha had been silently studying. The core confrontation was brutal because it was wordless yet perfectly clear. He moved slowly, deliberately, emerging fully from the fog. His eyes, the color of rich, wet mahogany, fixed on mine. There was no anger. Anger is active. It implies a desire to fight or change the outcome. What I saw was resignation, a deep, ancient form of pity so profound it felt like a physical blow to my chest. He didn't speak with his voice, not in the way humans understand it, but the images he projected into my mind were sharper, colder, and more organized than any language I had ever learned. The first image was a pristine river, clean enough to drink. The second image was the same river, choked with plastic and foaming chemicals, and then immediately following a flash of my own face, standing helpless by the toxic bank. Then came the true critique, the devastating summation based entirely on the philosophy I had gifted him. "You teach the rule of 7, the mental voice echoed, resonant like stone scraping stone. But you live by the hour. You calculate the harvest, but you do not calculate the inheritance. You demand growth in one season that cannot be paid back over 7. He projected a vision of our society, cities sprawling like cancerous growths, consuming the landscape with manic speed. He showed me the great forests being cleared, not for need, but for profit, for paper, for fleeting desire. And always, always, the emphasis was on the immediate, the now. The 7th generation, the ghost children of the future, were rendered completely invisible to us. The promise is simple. The thought pressed into my skull, heavy and undeniable. Every action must honor the faces of those yet to be born. Your people look forward only to see their own reflection in greater abundance. They see themselves 7 times over, magnified, greedy, and ungrateful for the world they were given. The climax. It was here, in the cold mud, facing this creature whose intelligence felt older than the continents, that the full revelation shattered my world. I had tried to present the 7 generations principle as a pathway to survival, a blueprint for eternal stewardship. Kasha saw it as a historical document detailing humanity's terminal disease. He raised one massive hand, and the movement was not one of threat, but of definition. He showed me 3 things, one after the other, each image searing itself into my memory with agonizing clarity. First, the concept of waste. We throw away food and resources that could sustain countless lives. The ancient peoples, his people, viewed the creation of unnecessary waste as a spiritual crime, a direct theft from the future. He showed me mountains of refuse, shining under an indifferent sun, a monument to our refusal to accept limits. Second, the concept of time acceleration. He conveyed the idea that human beings are trapped in a feedback loop of constant acceleration. We move too fast to look back, and critically, too fast to look forward. The pace of modern life, the need for instant communication, instant travel, instant gratification, made the long-term, slow, meditative planning of the 7 generations concept inherently impossible for us. We were culturally, neurologically, and economically incapable of slow wisdom. Third, and most devastatingly, the concept of rejection. He looked at the vast, broken world humanity had created in defiance of this very philosophy, and he communicated a definitive, cold conclusion. This logic, this path you call wisdom, Kusha transmitted, stepping closer, his immense size making the ground tremble slightly. It is not a solution for your kind. It is only the measure of how deeply you have failed. We listen to the philosophy. We observe the result. The path is rejected because the practitioners are inherently incapable of following it. You are destructive children playing with things you do not understand. His eyes in that moment held not anger, but a bottomless, aching sadness. It was the sorrow of a parent watching a child dismantle their own future, knowing they lacked the capacity to stop. The time slowed down. The air tasted of ozone and regret. I saw not a monster, but a judge who had finished reviewing the evidence and found the defendant guilty on all counts. He was telling me that humanity, as currently constituted, was an existential danger to the planet because our deepest, most profound wisdom, when truly understood and applied, only served to highlight the depth of our unavoidable self-destruction. Then, he turned. He didn't run. He didn't vanish in a flash of speed. He simply walked away, the heavy, deliberate thud of his steps echoing the finality of his decision. He walked into the thickest part of the ancient forest, dissolving into the green shade, taking the concept of the 7 generations with him. It was a rejection not just of me, but of the human species' potential for moral reform. The sound of his departure was the final sound I heard. Silence fell again, but this time it was the silence of emptiness, aftermath, and consequences. I wandered out of those woods 3 days later, unrecognizable. My clothes were shredded, my face covered in stubble and mud, but it was my mind that was truly ruined. The man who taught the philosophy was dead. Only the messenger remained, burdened by the terrible truth. I quit the Forest Service immediately. I wrote a letter citing irreconcilable psychological trauma, which they readily accepted. They needed an easy explanation for my sudden paranoid behavior. I destroyed every journal, every photograph, every map detailing our encounter. The truth was too heavy to leave lying around. The guilt corroded me like acid. I didn't feel guilty for having met him. I felt guilty for having proven to him, through the mechanism of my own teaching, that humanity was doomed. My whole life became a long, isolated nightmare. I moved to the furthest reaches of the country, away from the forests I loved because I couldn't bear the shame of looking at a healthy tree and knowing how swiftly its descendants would be consumed. The government didn't visit me with black suits and flashing lights as they do in the cheap stories. They didn't need to. The knowledge was my prison. The government visits were internalized, the constant nightmares, the relentless voice of Kasha in my head, listing the failures of the day, the pollution reports, the logging quotas, the political short-sightedness, all measured against the faces of the children of the 7th generation, whom we betray with every breath we take. Now, decades later, my hands shake constantly. My voice trembles, thin and reedy, not from age, but from the effort of carrying this truth. I sit here finally confessing into this recorder, because the burden has become too much. I see the world spiraling, the climate crises, the economic instability, the endless cycle of fighting over the now. And I hear Kasha's final cold judgment ringing clear. We had the wisdom, we had the blueprint. We showed it to the ancient world, and the ancient world looked at our actions and simply walked away. That is the true tragedy. The wisdom exists, but we are genetically blind to it. Some things in those woods were never meant for us. They were meant for better stewards, for creatures whose sense of time extended beyond the span of a single lifespan. Kasha is still out there. His kind is still watching. They are not waiting for us to catch up. They are waiting for us to burn out so that the slow, silent wisdom of the forest can finally begin to heal the scars we left. He rejected the human concept of hope because he saw our inherent inability to change the timeline of our consumption. The truth is not that Bigfoot is a frightening monster. The truth is that Bigfoot is the keeper of time, and he has already condemned us. We failed the test of the 7 generations the moment we were born into this modern rush. If this story moved you, if you recognize the bitter truth of what the ancient world knows about us, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there, and for God's sake, try to look 7 generations ahead, even if you know deep down it's already too late.